women's health is at risk, women are still in danger, women are still taking the abortion pill illegally.
Well, wow, what a film. That was an amazing piece of work there we just all saw. And it's great to see Andrea and Ailbhe on our screens, the narrative heart of what we just saw in the film. But let's talk to Maeve. Maeve is here on the call. She's one of the co-directors of this, and the person behind the camera, the person behind the scenes, but the creative force behind this. So Maeve, maybe we could talk a bit about, look, where did you get the idea for this film?
Well, I'm just speaking myself and also on behalf of my two co-directors, Aideen Kane and Lucy Kennedy. We came together back in about 2016. Personally, I had always thought about doing a film about a woman traveling to the UK or beyond, just to document a journey. And that was one idea I had. I got chatting with Aideen one time, and I'd known Aideen for about 10 years. And she also was quite interested in the issue. She had met Lucy Kennedy, and she felt that Lucy, an investigative journalist, would be an amazing kind of addition to the team. So she kind of just approached the two of us, Aideen did, and kind of said, would we do it together? So this was way back in 2016. The three of us came together, and I suppose we decided to join forces. We were all like different kind of skills. Aideen, a producer, Lucy, an investigative journalist, and me, a kind of long form storyteller, editor. So we felt that we could get it over the line. One of the main motivating factors, as I say, the journey and the idea of documenting the journey. I think one of the main motivating factors, certainly for me, and I think for Aideen and Lucy too, was around the silence and the stigma that went on in Ireland around, women traveling to the UK and beyond for an abortion. You never really heard those stories. There was kind of a deafening silence around the issue. And so I think we talked a lot about that, and that we wanted to incorporate that, or that would be one of the motivating factors for doing the film. And hence in the film, when you see the chorus of voices, that was always an original idea. That was an idea that was at the very, very beginning of the kind of, coming together of the idea. And also we recorded the women very early on too, and it was just kind of like the heart of the film on some level. Another reason, I suppose, was the three of us had grown up in Ireland under the shadow of the 8th. We'd all witnessed these tragic cases from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and it just felt very much like a story for our generation to tell.
Yeah, fascinating. And I felt the aspects of the film was obviously with Ailbhe and Andrea being kind of the protagonists, if you like, and that they represent, you guys represent two different generations, and how this is a cross-generational issue for women in Ireland. How did you guys all meet? I don't know, Ailbhe, do you want to come in here? You're obviously well known in the women's movement, but tell us how this whole connection happened between you guys on screen and Maeve and her co-creators behind the screen.
Well, really, it was an approach from Maeve and Lucy and Aideen, although actually not all three of them in the one place at the same time, but who didn't have to work at all hard to convince me that this was a really interesting and important thing to do, because that was back in 2016, Maeve, I think. Yeah, right. So we weren't actually we didn't have commitment to a referendum, maybe even at that time, but it was definitely on the way. But at that stage, it was very clear already that this was going to be a really big campaign. We were not going away until we had removed the 8th Amendment from the Constitution. So if that was a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, there was enough momentum there, and there was a great buzz about it. And it seemed to me that this was, if we succeeded, and I was pretty sure that if we could get going, we could topple them, because of that momentum. I felt this really is historic. This would be such a historic moment, so important for women, and the hundreds and thousands of women, just why I love the chorus in the film, who have had to be silent all these years, and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of women who couldn't get abortion and therefore have been even more silent over the years, that this would be truly, truly, truly historic, and for Ireland as a country, and also, for women elsewhere in the world, where Ireland was, I think, so inaccurately perceived as a very Catholic country, because I think that was already waning from the 1990s. But in any case, that this would be a very strong signal to women elsewhere that you can win even after 35 years.
Yeah, great. And Andrea, what about you? How did you get involved?
I remember it was around the election time, the general election, and I have a nail bar, and I was watching the kind of interest from the girls. At the start there was not a mention of the election, and then after somebody came in who was running, they suddenly, their interest was piqued. So I was like, oh my God, this is really interesting of how small an amount of exposure can pique this amount of interest. So I kind of started my own little project targeting young women. And Ailbhe was the queen of the coalition, which was a group that was full of loads of different people. And I approached her and I went to her and said, this is what I'm thinking of doing. And she's like, welcome in. And I really respected, I suppose, that, because we had a bit of problems at the start of people going, just join something. Whereas Ailbhe was one of these people who just saw the goodness of having many voices and welcoming everyone in. And I really respected how she managed everyone's different voices and desires and demands. And she was just this key woman, almost playing chess of all the different relationships in the campaign and just making everyone feel valuable and necessary. And that was my first meeting with Ailbhe. And then I joined the coalition, and I'd never been in anything like it before. I'd never really been interested in politics or whatever. So I was in this whole new world of like coalition meetings and all the minutes happening. And yeah, it was a really eye-opening moment. And then Maeve and Aideen, I think it was, came to me for coffee. I think they'd spoken to you, Ailbhe, about
Yes.
About people doing their bits. And
I knew Andrea, yes.
Yeah, you recommended Andrea then, yeah. Because that's, Andrea, what you're discussing there is again, one of the themes of the film, which is the activism. And it really captures the reality of a campaign. And even for me watching it in Washington, I'm an Irish woman in my early 40s. I even feel somewhere probably between your two generations, Andrea and Ailbhe, but I feel like that activism when I was about, in my early 20s wasn't really there in Ireland. Like, I don't remember that the marches, in Dublin, or it just, there wasn't an issue. Whereas what seems to have happened, I think, and maybe this is why an American audience, it's such a reflection on contemporary Irish society, that there has been a lot of activism because we've had that referendum and the previous referendum on marriage equality. And so it's kind of an analysis or a demonstration, I suppose, of the power of that activism. Like, Maeve, you were saying there how you grew up in the shadow of, you lived this life, so many women of Ireland. Do you think activism, am I right, that Irish women, Irish people, Irish youth have become more politically engaged?
Well, I mean, I certainly feel like, I remember one time, the early days when I met Ailbhe for a coffee, just we were getting to know each other, and I didn't remember this level of activism when I was in college in Ireland, now granted the X case happened when I was in college, so that was massive, but so that was huge. But at the same time, just generally speaking, I felt that there wasn't the same kind of groundswell towards ideas. At that time, there was something really magical and unbelievable about this particular movement. I mean, it kind of captured everybody's imagination, not just the kind of campaign activists, but also like artists. There was political art, there was the jumpers, there was lots of poetry, and it was just really interesting the way it kind of excelled, and it just gained this incredible momentum, I suppose, from 2012 on, if you guys would agree, and it had this time, it had a 6-year kind of lead in, if you like, and so it was absolutely massive by the end. I was completely blown away by it. It was very different for my generation, I'm sure. Yeah, definitely.
Ailbhe, I mean, you've been on your fair share of marches over the years, and you've lived through a lot of social change or lack of social change in Ireland. What did you feel, or even watching the film there again, what did you feel about this youth activism? Was this a kind of special campaign, do you think?
Oh, yes, I think so. But, I would definitely say that after the X case in 1993, it was really very difficult to, there's always a level of activism, and that goes on, but there weren't mass movements in a very real sense. And during the 1990s, Ireland was very busy being prosperous or becoming prosperous and enjoying, neoliberalism and consumerism and so on. And then, then we went, I was going to say we went bankrupt, except that we gave the banks money. So we never did go bankrupt, but we should have gone bankrupt. And we had no money anymore. And it was very, very tough in that first decade of the 2000s. And we had another abortion referendum there, which was actually very low key. They were asking the same question again. We'd already answered it and so on. But around about that time, I remember being involved in 2 or 3 different kinds of initiatives where we were really trying to emphasize the fact that feminism and feminists had to get up on our bicycles again and start pedaling really hard, because we had a lot of unfinished business. So that even before the tragic death in 2012 of Savita Halappanavar, which was perceived as the catalyst, and I think quite rightly as the catalyst for the movement per se, there was a recognition and there was a burgeoning movement, and we were putting the pieces in place. So that a big campaign of that kind rarely springs out of absolutely nowhere. It is always the result of a process. And I mean, I certainly knew in 2012, because I was very centrally involved in the marriage equality campaign, that if we could win that referendum, we would then be able to demand a referendum on abortion, but that marriage equality needed to go first, because it's strangely a much easier sell. You're saying to people, oh, please let us be like you. Please let us have love and happiness forevermore, and we'll just forget the reality of divorce for the moment. So you're actually talking about families, you're talking about love, you're talking about togetherness forever and so on. Whereas you're asking people to let you do something which they approve of. Whereas with abortion, that is absolutely not the case. And most women don't actually particularly want to talk about it, and men certainly don't want to talk about it. Nobody thinks, oh, I'd really love to I'll celebrate this. It's not like that. So we had to have marriage equality first, and that was a great success.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because here in the United States, I mean, exactly what you say. I mean, they won the battle eventually about gay marriage, but the issue of abortion is more divisive, without a doubt, in this country. And
patriarchy is still very powerful. So control of women very directly through our bodies, whether that's abortion or whether it's through violence or indeed through economic deprivation, which is going to be very bad after the pandemic, that is still really, really strong. And we were all very conscious of that, I think, very.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about this at a time. I mean, I couldn't help thinking, there's a lot of concern among abortion rights activists here about Roe v. Wade, and we now have a very conservative majority on the Supreme Court, thanks to Donald Trump. And there's a lot of discussion now in this country. We also saw developments in Poland recently, so it can be very instructive to people. The referendum may have been won in Ireland, but in some places it's actually only getting started again for a second round, so it's quite instructive on that.
Yes.
And on that point, you're right, this issue you raised there about how people don't want to talk about it. And I mean, Maeve, one of the things that the film does is that you do look at the other side. Obviously there's a sense of this is a positive film. We know what happens at the end. You wonder, and but you do give the time to the other side. Can you talk a bit, maybe this for you, Maeve, about how you reached out to the other side? You had some figures, John McGurk, the people who were very involved in the No campaign.
Yeah, well, I mean, we, the three of us, sat down at the beginning as well and kind of talked about our feelings on the issue, obviously, all of us coming at it from a pro-choice perspective. And, so all documentaries have a point of view, and, we went to the pro-choice side first. I mean, the general consensus was, and it was, I will admit, like, it was difficult to know how to handle the other side and how much to do of it. In the context of the fact that we were already following the pro-choice side, we were already with Ailbhe and Andrea, do you know what I mean? And how do you do that? But, we did from early on actually approach many people on the other side to see if they'd be willing to talk to us. And I'll say that with the idea that we wanted to make it we did want to bring in the nuance. We wanted to show that there was this other side, this other point of view. We felt the film wouldn't work unless you were able to consider what, you know, the yes side were up against, for starters. And that said, I will also add, like, you know, all of us had, you know, various family members who were going to be voting, you know, no on this, and we were listening to that at home and that kind of stuff. So we certainly wanted to include it. But when we did, and I'm not going to name names, but we definitely got like pretty much a closed door a lot, like in terms of that side. Yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, it was really difficult to get someone to sit down with us and talk to us. And ultimately, we were lucky. I mean, I think that things started heating up, and we managed to speak to Cora Sherlock one day, I think outside the Dáil when she was protesting, and she agreed to an interview, and so we managed that. And then John McGurk gave us an interview right before the end, like literally it must have been about a week before, and you know, that was a strong interview in terms of his perspective, his point of view. And then of course Wendy Grace, you know, there was a lot of back and forth and persuasion in terms of getting her to agree, and ultimately she did, but we only ever got her once, you know what I mean? So it was difficult, I will say, but I do think it was really important to have it in the film, actually, because I feel like it does give a nuance and it does give a perspective, and you really do have to understand where they're coming from in order to understand what the other guys are, you know, in order to understand the largeness of this debate.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the aspects of the film is that you do look at this kind of the moderate vote, the in-between vote, people who aren't clear. We all know people like that, obviously. And the importance of winning them, like it's like fighting a general election. You know, you're always going to get the people who are diehard supporters of it's getting the people who are somewhere in between. And maybe like Andrea, I mean, did you feel when it's so interesting when you were talking about like meeting these young girls in your nail bar who were exercised by this issue, like, did you feel like most of the people you were dealing with, Andrea, were you know, pro-choice, or did you ever have to confront maybe, you know, somebody very pro-life, or was that part of what you guys were strategizing about when in that scene when you're all in the office and all that, as you described at the beginning, the actual nuts and bolts of the campaign?
I think the majority of the time we had an audience who were kind of wavering and didn't know, and needed to know more information rather than were strictly anti-choice or pro-choice. So our kind of thing was about bringing information in a way that was digestible and was on platforms that where people were, rather than trying to get them to other platforms. So there was no, like, a lot of our stuff was online because that's where our audience is. So we did obviously encounter maybe backlash there, but it was something that we weren't really focusing on. And I think managing online conversations is all about focusing on those who want to engage rather than those who are very definitely against what you're trying to do. So I think it was never a case of trying to force people to come to your way. It was more laying your cards out on the table and just maybe showcasing the information in a way that was digestible, for sure.
And there was door knocking happened as well. We see that in the film. People going around. I don't know. Did you do much of that, Andrea? Was it more online stuff you were doing?
I did do canvassing. It wasn't the main thing. Like when we're talking about this, a lot of the time I'm like, I am not a natural protester. I don't like going out on the street, which Ailbhe always gives out to me. And I'm not a natural canvasser. So it's like, how do I use my skills that what the things I'm good at, and how can I mobilize people, and how can I use my voice in a way that I enjoy? Because let's be honest, you're doing this, so how can I do it in a way that I enjoy, that can get results, that is using my energy in the best possible way, rather than doing what I think I should be doing that maybe won't be as effective. So I had a PR background. I knew how to do put together kind of communications plans. So that's how I channeled my energy and how I knew I could get the most effective results, rather than, I suppose, expending energy in a way that just would drain me. And I think that's really important with activism. And one of the reasons I agreed to kind of be in this film is like thinking about if this could encourage people who don't feel comfortable in those spaces but do want to fight for their rights, and that they do it in a way that suits them, and that you don't have to follow a blueprint of how activism is done, that there are different ways and it's all valid, and using your strengths is probably the most important thing to do.
Yeah, interesting. One of the aspects that was interesting as well watching the film was the moment, maybe it's just like the political junkie in me, because I thought it was great, the moment where a few weeks out, and then, you know, you identified, okay, this issue about the 12 weeks is becoming a problem. You know, we have to get out in front of this, if you like. And that was very interesting to watch, because it shows the sophistication of every kind of campaign like this, and that, you know, if you feel like you're losing something, to get out in front of it. Maybe, I don't know, Ailbhe, maybe you'd be good on this aspect. I mean, were you worried at that point, or how did you feel? Did you feel like that 12-week issue, for example, could be the issue that loses it for you?
Well, I'm not sure that we thought that. I think we thought that we would actually get ahead of it, that we would actually manage it. But we did have a week of strategizing and bringing in strategic people as well, to actually think how we would do it. And I think that does make a point generally about the campaign, that this was a very strategic campaign right from the get-go, going back to 2012, 2013. Nothing really happened just because it fell out of the blue sky. I mean, we were very aware all along of how strategic we needed to be, what kind of strategy we would use. Andrea has described a very central part of the strategy, which was that we focused on the people who were unsure. As one of our people said, the conflicted, but I think they were just a bit unsure, frankly. And it was our job to convince them. We didn't have to convince our side, and there was no point in trying to convince the other side. So the 12 weeks was to some extent a manufactured issue by the other side. So it was very clear to us that what we needed to do was keep our nerve, because, and we were a little bit surprised that, in fact, that we had got even the 12 weeks, which was really wonderful. So we felt that we needed to keep our nerve and focus on saying, but this, practically speaking, is what women need for their well-being and for their health. So, which were really our core messages of care and well-being and health and security and so on. And that really paid dividends, that we were very, very prepared in terms of our messaging and its logic and its rationale, and therefore where to place it and how to use it when the chips were down. But I mean, yes, I mean, I will agree that there was a nervous week there, because people do sort of begin to fuss, and you're saying, no, we can do this. But there were there were nervous times, but I never had a time, once we got going, I never ever doubted that we could win it. You can't ever say 100% sure we will, but I felt that we absolutely could win it, particularly when the money started to roll in, because people don't pay for something they don't believe in. And the money started to flood in after about 4 weeks, I think, into the campaign. And it was little sums of money from all kinds of people, and particularly from young people. So this was, young people wanted a different Ireland.
That's interesting. So I remember I was here in Washington for the Irish Times, obviously, and I actually had to cover a story up in New York with pro-life. There was controversy over effectively American fundraising for the Irish campaign. And I know this has always happened, that Ireland was one of the few places in the world where abortion was still outlawed and people would channel their money in. And I met a guy, a pro-life person up in New York outside, who was going to a court case about something to do with an abortion clinic. And it kind of really brought home to me, God, you know, people around the world for a certain constituency, they are looking at this, and it's in their interest for this not to pass. And actually on that, I mean, again, conscious we're here talking to an American audience. Something you said earlier, I thought, Ailbhe, was very interesting, which is, you know, talking about why this activism now, and obviously the Smyth deaths was a trigger of sorts. But this idea that maybe, you know, during the Celtic Tiger, there was this, when people write the history of Ireland, you know, that was a moment of materialism and abandon. And then the following decade, obviously, the consequences of that there was no room maybe for activism. There was no interest in that kind of hedonism of the first decade, and then the kind of despair of the second. And then, but what it also, I think, captures a bit about how Ireland has changed so much. And I find here, even though I love America, it's a great country, and the Irish American vote and the Irish American constituency is a really important part of life here. But sometimes there's a misunderstanding among Irish America about the reality of Ireland. and there is a sense that it's some idealistic, even though a lot of Irish Americans visit Ireland, that, you know, this idealistic notion that's very much, for some people, bound up with Catholicism. And the reality here is in America that most Irish Americans are Catholic, and it's part of that identity. Joe Biden encapsulates it. He calls himself an Irish Catholic.
Well, I mean, the reality is that by the 2000s, even the early 2000s, Irish people were far less Catholic in a sense. Their Catholicism had become kind of more a kind of Protestant Catholicism, where individual conscience was much more important. And that, of course, became an issue in the campaign, just as it had been in the marriage equality campaign, where people, because the church had shot itself in the foot back in the early 90s with the child clerical sex abuse cases, people's faith in the church was rattled just at a time when Ireland was becoming more prosperous, materialistic, and therefore also more secular. So you had a number of things happening in and around the same time, not necessarily coincidentally. So that when we came to the 2000s, I think as we got up towards 2009, 10, 11, 12, when we were beginning to see the end maybe of the very worst austerity, people were saying, you know, so much social change that hasn't kept pace. We haven't kept pace over the past few years. But I think the other thing is that because we've been a very, very, very young country with a much bigger youth population than many other European countries, I think there was also that pressure to create a better world. And I think that really has paid tremendous dividends. I mean, what's going to happen over the next decade in relation to the environment will be very fascinating. Is that going to hold good? Is that going to stay true? So one of the things, I'll finish just on this little point, from time to time, quite often, great Americans would come over and tell us, this is what you need to do, this is what you have to do. And it used to annoy me. And I remember I did say once to somebody, and I hope she'll forgive me, but it was in the heat of strategic battle. I said, well, it's not working for you over there. Why on earth do you think we should do it over here? That we looked at our context and saw all those young people, saw the failure of the Catholic Church, and therefore we didn't have to criticize the Catholic Church. We never criticized the Catholic Church. Why would we? It had done it for itself. That you really key principle of campaigning is that you absolutely need to do it in your context, in your way, and what works for your circumstances and the people you have to convince. And I think that we did get that right. I'm very, very proud of that, really, that we got that right.
Yeah, fascinating. So look, just as we finish up here, maybe I'll get some final thoughts from you. Maeve, I mean, what do you feel when you watch the film now, or maybe if you like, just to talk a little bit about that chorus. You talked about this at the beginning, but you know, we were left with that image. Is that to you kind of one of the key messages, as I said at the beginning, or?
I hope so. You know, I feel like going in, that was always the idea, and it was whether we would interweave it throughout or whether we would, you know, have it kind of come in a crisis point in the film. And so that was one of those kind of really kind of difficult editing things in the actual making of the film. And so the kind of idea was that it would come in as a kind of after Tume and after we've learned all of our historical kind of stuff, and that it would kind of, you know, the voices would be on some level you know, allowed to speak, and we would destigmatize the issue to some degree. I mean, I'm so grateful to the women who spoke to us. It was an incredibly humbling experience to speak to them. But yes, I think that would be one of the parts of the film that we're, you know, really pleased with. And it was to me, it's the heart of the film for sure. But I'm also really grateful to these two for you know, taking part in it and allowing us to film them through like what was incredibly stressful for everybody. I mean, it was an incredibly tense time, you know, and we were just constantly on the phone to them, begging them to let us come in all the time. And so I'm hugely appreciative to that. And I just hope that it stands as some kind of historical document of a really incredibly seminally important time in our Irish history. That's why we made it, you know, that's why we wanted it to live and document this time for younger women too, you know, who are coming up. to understand what happened.
Who might not remember, who were too
Might
young
not remember exactly.
experience it.
My little cousin did a little internship, and it was during the sound and the picture, at the very finishing of it, and she's only 16 at the time, and she said, wow, I didn't even know there was a referendum in 1983, and she just said, I just loved it, you know. And so I was just delighted, because I felt like that will be
informing.
Hopefully it will live to inform people, you know, coming up about this issue.
Great. Andrea, what about you? Closing thoughts that you took from the whole experience, or memories of that?
I think the main thing for me is that this film isn't like, even though like myself and Ailbhe are the protagonists, it's not our story. It's a story of so many people who did so much and put so much of their lives and time and energy into getting this over the line. And that, I think it's just, when I watch it, I just like, it was a really stressful time, but it was also a great time, and it was a really nice time for bringing women and women's advocates together and supporters, and the people you met and what it has led to then going forward. And I suppose it's really intrinsically placed values in people of what's important. And now that people are going on with their lives, they're demanding more for our rights and what we deserve. And I think that is just such a lovely thing to come out of it with.
And Ailbhe, final word to you.
Well, I first of all, you know, I really am very grateful to Maeve and to Aideen and to Lucy for making the film and for staying with it, because it wasn't at all an easy film to make, and to have people have faith in it and trust in it and so on. And I think they really did a wonderful job, because it's at one and the same time a very political film and very clear about what it's doing. And it is also incredibly sensitive, and everyone who speaks in that film is treated, the camera treats them, the people speaking to them treat them with the greatest of respect. And I think that in itself is very important. I also, I found it was often very tense to be followed around by camera. It was a bit worrying, but at the same time it was very interesting, and it made me think about things as the film was being made. That was during the actual campaign itself, and I often had to stand back and say, gosh, does that really stand up? Is that really the best thing for us to do? And I hope that it gives a sense of hope and optimism to women who are fighting in so many places around the world still, and also to ourselves in Ireland, because repealing the Eighth Amendment was the first step. We still have a lot more work to do on the issue of abortion and women's reproductive rights generally. So it was a great victory, but there is more that we absolutely have to do. And I think that's probably true for almost every country in the world, actually.
Okay, great. Well, look, thank you very much for that closing thought there, Ailbhe, and to our three panelists. Fascinating film, great discussion there, and we look forward to future collaboration, maybe this great creative combination. As Ailbhe said, you know, a lot more to do, as they say. So thanks again for joining, everyone.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you.